Welcome back with Professor P for Chapter 12, Settlement and Landscape. I hope you guys are staying safe and healthy out there. All right, let's start. Settlement archaeology is really the way in which archaeologists study households, communities, and ancient cultural landscapes. So looking at the interaction between individuals and groups and a lot of stuff within your settlement, like within your communities, all right? That becomes important. Settlement archaeology, the community becomes a very important part of the study, how individuals within the community relate to one another, maybe through trade, through religion, through social ties, through interactions, and things like that. We look at these kinds of things, right, becomes important. Things like politics and economics, all of that allows us to examine a variety of relationships within a community. So that becomes really important to sort of understand. Household and household groups are also very important. Households are really that archaeological unit sort of defining artifacts and reflecting the kinds of activities that you have within a household. So if we look at like what's going on in your kitchen, like what would we do if we weren't here anymore and an archaeologist would come and look at this feature and go, okay, this is the kinds of activities they were doing in these different areas of within a household, right? That becomes very important to sort of the understanding of these types of settlement patterns. Activity areas are that. It's sort of looking at a site that indicates a specific activity, like tool making, like where did tool making take place within the community or, within the residential area. That becomes quite important. All right, let's move on. When we talk about communities, we're really talking about the number of people who are occupying a specific place, a specific settlement, and a specific time period, right? Looking at family ties and kin ties, layouts of households or dwellings, right? Were they living in barrio areas? Were they living in, village sites, right? It's really looking at mapping and all that kind of, good stuff, right? That becomes very important to understand. We could look at like villages and look at how maybe they have networks within the system, maybe they're networking with other communities, within the area. So that becomes important. All right, let's look at population and settlement patterns. We look at three things when we look at settlement patterns. Environmental change is one. Number two is interaction between individuals. And three is the shift in population density. Is there a lot of people in there? Is there not? Right, looking at population density. If we look at, for example, like an urban environment like San Francisco or New York City, the population density is very high there. Okay, just so you understand that. That becomes important to sort of understand. Landscape. Landscape is really cool. Landscape is basically a perception of environment that was created by humans, right? So it's your perception of that area. The landscape of memory is a perception of the landscape retained by you during your lifetime, okay? So let's take an example of Brentwood, California, and go, okay, what was your landscape of memory like when you were younger? Like, what did it look like? What did you do? What were the activities that you did? And then now with all the changes, having Highway 4 bypass, Slatton Ranch, the streets of Brentwood, all the schools that are built, right? All of this development now, your landscape of memory when you were a child is going to be different than these changes that took place, and now the landscape is going to be different for you, right? So you could look back at areas that you grew up with and go, oh my gosh, right? My memory was this about that community, and now with all these changes, this is where, my memory is at today, or what I think, or the perception. Some of you grew up in Oakley and you're like, oh my God, look at the changes now, the downtown. I remember when I first got my teaching job here, I had to drive through Oakley to get to the Brentwood campus, and I ended up by the water. I had no idea. It was very rural. It was very desolate. It was nice, but it was just empty. And now, you could see the changes, right? Grocery stores, government offices, new restaurants, building houses and communities. It's very it's densely populated now for a rural environment. So that becomes important. Landscape research is important. It tells us three things. The first one is the physical characteristics and the properties. So looking at the physical characteristics. Number two is the historical transformation over time. Many of you could look at the history and the changes over time of a community, even of your households in general. The third one is the person's physical and symbolic relationship with that environment. So maybe the sacred environment or the sacred landscape of the community can be involved. That becomes very important. that leads me to the sacred landscape. That's very intangible. It's an intangible human behavior. You know, when we look at religious sites, we look at pyramids, we look at, pyramids being built for very important ritualistic identity, the ceremonial activities, the adornment, right? Maybe a human sacrifice of the Mayas, right? So when we look at sacred landscape, we're really looking at the symbolic representation of the sacred world around them, their perception of the world around them, right? And their faith-based and things like that. So that becomes important. If we do a discussion board on this chapter or we do an activity, there's a couple questions I would probably have you answer. So remember, when you look at landscape, it becomes very important to understanding the world around us, the community, the trade, the interaction between people within the community, residential versus industrial areas, right? So remember, read that chapter really well. I hope you enjoyed it. I love to look at my landscape of memory. I remember growing up in San Francisco, and I could see the changes now from when I grew up till now. BART was something you got on in Muni, and your community was very interactive, and now you could see those changes, right, taking place. It's not as communal for me anymore. I don't live there anymore, but you could see all the changes within that environment over time. And those changes, we could look at a lot of different aspects and factors of those changes, right? So think about your own space and your own place, your own households. Are you guys remodeling right now? Why are you changing your households? How has your community changed? Really think about that and enjoy the landscape of memory. All right, Professor P, I'll see you for the next chapter. Have a good day.